Our first story takes us deep into the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, where a group of college friends decided to spend their summer break camping. The group consisted of 5 friends: Jake, Sarah, Mark, Lisa, and Emily. They were experienced campers, well prepared with gear and supplies, eager to explore the untouched beauty of the Appalachian wilderness. The first few days were perfect. They hiked through stunning trails, swam in crystal-clear rivers, and enjoyed nights around the campfire, sharing stories and laughter. On the 3rd night, as they were roasting marshmallows, they heard it for the first time. Faint whispers coming from the woods. At first, they dismissed it as the wind or their imagination. But as the night grew darker, the whispers became more distinct and closer. Jake, the most adventurous of the group, decided to investigate. He grabbed his flashlight and headed into the woods, telling the others he would be back soon. Minutes turned into hours, and Jake did not return. The remaining friends grew anxious and decided to search for him. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, and now they seemed to be calling their names. They found Jake's flashlight lying on the ground, still on, but there was no sign of Jake. Panic set in as they realized they were lost. The whispers surrounded them, echoing from every direction. They ran, desperate to find their way back, but the forest seemed to close in around them. Hours later, exhausted and terrified, they stumbled back to their campsite, only to find it completely ransacked. Their tents were shredded, supplies scattered, and there were strange symbols carved into the trees. As dawn approached, the whispers finally stopped. But Jake was never found, and the remaining friends left the woods, vowing never to return. To this day, they still hear the whispers in their dreams, calling them back to the forest. Our next story takes place in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. A young couple, Tom and Alice, decided to go on a camping trip to celebrate their anniversary. They found a secluded spot by a serene lake, miles away from civilization. It was perfect, or so they thought. The first night was peaceful, with the sounds of the lake lulling them to sleep. But on the second night, Alice woke up with an uneasy feeling. She thought she heard footsteps outside their tent. She woke Tom, but he dismissed it as an animal and went back to sleep. Alice, however, couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, they found strange footprints around their campsite. They were human, but too large and too deep to be an ordinary person. Tom tried to reassure Alice, but she couldn't shake her fear. That night, the footsteps returned, circling their tent closer and closer. Tom, now alarmed, grabbed his hunting knife and flashlight, ready to confront whatever was out there. As he stepped outside, the footsteps stopped. The forest was eerily silent. Tom searched the area but found nothing. They decided to cut their trip short and leave the next morning. But as they packed up their gear, they found a crude wooden doll hanging from a tree near their tent. It looked like a human figure, bound with string, and its face was painted with a grotesque, mocking grin. Terrified, they hurried to pack up and leave. As they drove away, Alice looked back and saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching them. It was tall, with unnaturally long limbs and glowing eyes. They never spoke of their experience to anyone, but the memory of the watcher haunted them for the rest of their lives. Our third story is about a group of friends who stumbled upon an abandoned cabin while hiking in the Rocky Mountains. Mike, Karen, David and Laura had been hiking all day and were looking for a place to set up camp for the night. When they found the cabin, it seemed like a perfect spot. It offered shelter and a bit of comfort after a long day on the trail. The cabin was old and run down, but it provided a roof over their heads. As they settled in, they found old furniture, dusty and covered in cobwebs, but nothing out of the ordinary. That night, as they sat around the fireplace, they heard strange noises, scratching sounds coming from the walls and ceiling. They tried to brush it off as animals, but the noises grew louder and more persistent. Mike, the bravest of the group, decided to investigate. He climbed up to the attic, flashlight in hand. The others waited anxiously below. Moments later, they heard Mike scream, followed by a heavy thud. They rushed upstairs to find him lying on the floor, unconscious, with deep scratches covering his face and arms. As they tried to revive Mike, they noticed strange symbols carved into the wooden beams of the attic, symbols that seemed to pulse with an eerie, otherworldly light. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and a cold, malevolent presence filled the room. They grabbed Mike and fled the cabin, leaving their belongings behind. They managed to reach a ranger station the next day, where they reported their encounter. The rangers seemed unfazed and told them that the cabin had a dark history. It was once owned by a recluse who dabbled in dark rituals. He disappeared mysteriously, and the cabin had been abandoned ever since. The friends left the mountains never to return, but the memory of that night and the evil presence in the cabin stayed with them forever. Our fourth story is about a family who went camping in a remote part of the Black Hills in South Dakota. John and Mary took their 2 children, Emma and Ben, for a weekend getaway in nature. They found a picturesque spot by a babbling brook, surrounded by tall pines. The first night was uneventful, and the family enjoyed their time together. But on the second night, things took a sinister turn. Emma woke up in the middle of the night, saying she saw a man standing outside their tent. John checked but found nothing. He reassured Emma it was just a dream and put her back to bed. The next day they found strange markings on the trees around their campsite. They looked like runes or symbols, but none of them could decipher their meaning. That night, Emma and Ben both woke up screaming, saying the man was back, standing at the edge of the campsite, just watching them. John and Mary decided to keep watch, taking turns staying awake. Around midnight, Mary heard footsteps approaching their tent. She shone her flashlight outside but saw nothing. The footsteps continued, circling their tent, growing louder and more insistent. Suddenly, the tent flap flew open and a gust of freezing wind blew inside. They grabbed their children and fled to their car, driving away as fast as they could. They never went back to that campsite, but they later learned that the area was notorious for strange disappearances and ghost sightings. The man Emma and Ben saw was believed to be the spirit of a missing hiker who had vanished years ago. The family never spoke of their terrifying experience again, but the haunted campsite remained etched in their memories. Our final story involves a solo camper named Mark, who decided to spend a week in the remote wilderness of Alaska to find peace and solitude. Mark was an experienced outdoorsman, confident in his survival skills. He hiked deep into the forest, far from any trails or signs of civilization, and set up his camp by a tranquil lake. For the first few days, everything went smoothly. Mark enjoyed the serenity of nature, fishing, and exploring the area. But on the fourth night, he noticed something strange. He found a set of footprints near his campsite that weren't his. They were large and seemed to follow him wherever he went. Mark grew uneasy, but he convinced himself it was just his imagination. That night, as he lay in his tent, he heard heavy breathing outside, followed by the sound of something large moving through the brush. He grabbed his rifle and flashlight, ready to confront whatever was out there. But when he stepped outside, there was nothing, only silence and darkness. The next day, he found more footprints, this time closer to his tent. He decided to cut his trip short and head back to civilization. But as he packed up his gear, he felt a sudden chill. The forest grew silent, and a sense of dread washed over him. He started his hike back, but the feeling of being watched never left him. As night fell, he realized he was lost. The familiar trails seemed to vanish, and he couldn't find his way. Panic set in as the forest closed in around him. He set up a makeshift camp, hoping to find his bearings in the morning. But that night, the breathing returned, closer than ever. He shone his flashlight into the darkness and saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at him. Mark ran, abandoning his gear, desperate to escape. He stumbled through the forest, disoriented and terrified. By dawn, he was found by a search party, disheveled and incoherent. He was taken to a hospital where he recounted his ordeal. The search party found his campsite, but there was no sign of the creature that had stalked him. Mark never returned to the wilderness. The experience left him deeply traumatized, and he spent the rest of his life haunted by the memory of those glowing eyes and the feeling of being hunted. The forest had taken something from him that he could never get back, leaving him with a lingering sense of terror that never truly went away.